Today, we're discussing Belle Gunness, who was a Black Widow serial killer from LaPorte, Indiana, who over a period of 25 years in the late 19th, early 20th century, murdered at least 14 people. Some historians estimate her body count could be as high as 40. Many of the victims were newly arrived Norwegian immigrants, seduced by the promise of a Norwegian life on a farm not far from Chicago. Described as, and this is rather less than complimentary, a fat, heavy-featured woman with a big head covered with a mop of mud-coloured hair, small eyes, huge hands and arms, and a gross body supported by feet grotesquely small. She has some of the most descriptive names in the true crime genre: the LaPorte Ghoul, the Indiana Ogress, Lady Bluebeard, and finally, Hell's Princess. She was born in the Norwegian town of Selbu in 1859, Brunhilde Paulsdottir Storsett. She grew up on her parents' farm, so she milked cows, churned butter, wrangled animals, very much an active participant in daily farm life. But her family was very poor, and her desire to rise up from poverty. Now, Belle was one of 7 children, and in around 1880, her sister Nellie emigrated to the USA and married an American man by the name of John Larson. After a few years, she invited Belle to join her. Belle made her way to Chicago and started looking for work as a housekeeper. Initially, she helped her sister Nellie's family out with cooking and cleaning and sewing, but according to Nellie, all Belle seemed laser focused on was money. Her first husband, Matt Sorensen, was a night watchman at the Mandel Brothers department store, where he made $15 a week. They were married within a year of Belle's arrival in Chicago. During this time, Belle was desperate to have a baby, and it was this struggle to conceive that drove a wedge between her and her sister Nellie, who had already managed to pop out 5 kids by the turn of the century. Belle actually asked Nellie if she could just, have one of hers. As a compromise, Nellie allowed one of her daughters to stay with Belle for a while. But it became very unpleasant when she was collected, because Belle was so passive-aggressive and annoyed that the child couldn't just stay with her indefinitely. Her sister said, "No, you can't just keep my 4-year-old forever." And in response, Belle just cut off all contact with Nellie. However, by 1891, Belle had apparently come across a dying woman with an 8-month-old baby. And the woman supposedly put her infant, Jenny, into Belle's arms and made her swear to take care of the child. In 1884, Belle and Mads bought a sweet shop in Chicago, a candy store. They sold cigarettes and groceries. After less than a year, a fire from a supposed exploding kerosene lamp burnt the place to the ground and was so rewarded with a large insurance payout. Well, she's got 5 kids, none of which were hers, and it's said that she might have either stolen them or perhaps purchased them from desperate women, which was not unheard of at the time. 2 of the babies died before they were 6 months old. The causes of death are unknown. Belle decided it was time to make some more money, and they engineered another insurance payout by setting fire to part of their own house, having insured their belongings previously. And it just so happened that on that day, July 30th, Mads Sorensen died. According to Belle, he'd come home that evening from his job with a fearful headache, and so Belle had given him some quinine powder and sent him to bed. When she checked on him later, he was dead. Belle was suddenly $7,000 richer It's about $150,000 in today's money. Next, Belle responded to an advert in the Chicago Tribune by a man looking to sell his farm at LaPorte, Indiana. Before long, she had bought and moved into the property. She was also on the lookout for a new husband who could help her. And this husband came in the shape of Peter Gunness, a widower with 2 daughters who had recently lost his wife in childbirth. Within months of Peter marrying Belle and his family moving in on the Gunness farm, Peter's 7-month-old daughter died suddenly and sadly. Within 6 months of his daughter's death, Peter Gunness would be dead too. On December 16th, 1901, neighbours were awoken by young Jenny Gunness knocking on their door. Now, according to her stepfather Peter had burned himself and needed help. But when the neighbours arrived back at the farm, what they actually found was Peter lying in a bloody heap on the floor with an obviously broken nose. They called the county coroner, one Dr. Belle. In addition to the broken nose, Peter also had a massive injury on the back of his head. Dr. Belle immediately suspected foul play, but Belle managed to give a fairly convincing impression of a hysterical wife. She explained that as Peter was bending down, retrieving his shoes from the kitchen, the meat grinder somehow fell off the shelf above his head. And she said, despite this, he had assured her that he was okay and had gone and laid down. Hours later, she discovered him dead on the floor. There just wasn't enough evidence to suggest that the death was anything other than accidental. The next surprise was that only a couple of months after the funeral, Belle apparently gave birth to another baby. And this was a shock, as everyone who had seen Belle at the funeral had said she hadn't been visibly pregnant. But, okay. However, when the midwife called on Belle only hours after the birth, she discovered the baby washed and dressed and Belle up and about doing chores. However, she was really puzzled when she called back the following day and found Belle busy chasing pigs around her farmyard. Also, add to this the fact that the infant was remarkably large for a newborn. After 2 years of working the farm alone, she decided that she'd actually like a little help, and she put an ad in the local Norwegian-speaking newspaper for a hired hand. 30-year-old Norwegian immigrant Olaf Lindboe answered the advert and showed up in LaPorte in 1904 with his life savings of $600. He worked for Belle for 2 months and then wrote to his father in Norway, hinting that he might be about to get married soon. But in April, Belle went over to her neighbour's farm and told him that Olaf had suddenly left to go to the World's Fair in St. Louis. Olaf was never seen again. A few months later, Olaf was replaced by Henry Gerhold, who answered, again, a help-wanted ad. But within 3 months, Belle was back at Chris Christopherson's place, bitching that now Henry'd left for Chicago. The question is, how did Belle Gunness murder her many victims? Traditionally, the most common weapon in the Black Widow's arsenal is poison. But later, judging from the bodies found on her property, Belle stabbed or chopped at least some of her victims to death face to face. A local farmhand at the time said that a different man arrived at the Gunness homestead almost every week, and Belle introduced them all as her cousins. Polish immigrant William Brogiski said that he was hired in 1906 by Belle to dig a few holes in her hog pen 6 feet long by 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep. For rubbish disposal, of course. Brogiski said that he had no reason to doubt her. When they were discovered, the bodies weren't just neatly stacked. Belle had always treated each body the same, sawing off the head, arms and legs before wrapping each part carefully in a burlap sack and then dumping the parts into each hole before covering them over with quicklime. In the autumn of 1906, Belle murdered her own adopted daughter, Jenny. Now, we don't really know why she did it, but probably the most likely reason is that Jenny had realised what her mother was doing, and it wasn't safe anymore for Belle to keep her around. There was one lucky escape, someone that lived to tell the tale, and that was George Anderson from Missouri. Said he came to the Gunness home and fell asleep in the guest bedroom on his first night, completely satisfied with the arrangement he'd found. No worries at all. But around midnight, he said he woke with a strange feeling, and he saw Belle standing silently next to his bed, watching him sleep, and with what he described as a sinister expression on her face. After a moment, she ran from the room. Anderson fled from the house the next morning. In 1907, Belle employed local farmhand Ray Lamphere to help with the chores. Ray Lamphere was known to spend every penny he earned on drinking, gambling, and purchased affection. Ray would have happily married Belle if that offer had been on the table, but it wasn't, because A, Ray was local, and Belle wasn't about to draw attention to herself by marrying and then disappearing a local man. B, he didn't have any money to steal. And C, he was useful. She needed to keep the farm in good working order to attract more and more suitors. One of these final suitors was named Andrew Helgelein, whom Belle began to exchange letters with in 1907. By January 1908, Andrew had arrived in LaPorte with a cheque for $2,900, his life savings. Mere days later, he and Gunness appeared at her bank in LaPorte and deposited the cheque. And then he vanished. It's believed that Belle murdered him the very same day, as when Ray Lamphere returned from an errand that evening, Helgelein was already gone. When Andrew Helgelein's friends and family hadn't heard from him in 2 weeks, they started to get worried. But while Andrew, as per Belle's request, hadn't told anyone where he was going, there was a paper trail of evidence. Indeed, family members found a pile of correspondence which detailed promises of land and love from a mysterious woman in LaPorte, Indiana, named Belle Gunness. Before long, his brother, Asler, wrote to Belle asking where his brother was. She fobbed him off by replying that she would also like to know where Andrew had run off to. As far as she knew, he'd gone to Norway to visit his relatives. Asler wrote back saying he did not believe his brother would do that, and that he was convinced he was still in LaPorte. Meanwhile, on February the 3rd, Belle's trusty farmhand, Ray Lamphere, either quit or was more likely fired, and was swiftly replaced by a man named Joe Maxon. Over the next weeks, Ray embarked on a campaign of skulking around the Gunness farm in an attempt to reclaim what he said were lost wages and to retrieve property he left behind. Finally, Belle got irritated and called up the local sheriff, who had Ray arrested for trespassing. He was pronounced sane and released. In April 1908, Belle told the shopkeeper at a store that Ray Lamphere was perfectly capable of murdering Belle and her children before setting fire to her house. The following day, Belle visited her lawyer and said the same thing again, adding that if anything was to happen to her, she would want her children, Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip, to inherit her money. The lawyer found it especially strange as she failed to mention her fourth child, Jenny, who had gone to college in California several years previously. After the meeting, Belle went shopping and came home with cakes, a toy train, and 2 gallons of kerosene. In the early hours of the morning, her house burned down. Ray Lamphere was arrested almost immediately. And when Asler Helgelein heard the news, he dropped everything and rushed to Indiana. The sheriff drove him straight to the Gunness farm. By then, nearly a week had passed since the fire, and the skull of Belle Gunness had yet to be found. 4 bodies had been recovered, 3 children and 1 adult female. Strange, remarked the coroner, that the head of the adult was missing, especially since that made it that much harder to formally identify the corpse. Local papers suggested that vengeful Ray Lamphere must have done it, decapitated her and set fire to the house. Before he left, Asler Helgelein was having a look around the farm and making inquiries when Joe Maxon happened to mention a couple of soft depressions in the ground in the hog pen he'd noticed in the spring. The men didn't have to investigate far before they uncovered the first of Belle's grisly surprises, barely covered by the fresh earth. Their shovels hit what was discovered to be a burlap sack, which when pulled out and inspected was found to contain 2 hands, 2 feet, and 1 head. Asler recognized immediately the withered, rotten face. It was his brother. When the men looked up, they realized with horror that there were dozens of slumped depressions in Belle Gunness's yard. The earth was filled with bags of torsos and hands, arms hacked off from the shoulders down. The scale of the atrocity quickly became apparent. On day 1, 5 bodies were uncovered. On the second day, 9, and then 11. After 14, the police stopped counting. Most of the remains couldn't be identified. As police soon pieced together, Belle Gunness had lived a double life as a serial killer. It didn't take long for it to dawn on investigators that the identity of the headless woman in Gunness's basement was a matter of public safety. If the body didn't belong to Gunness and weighing close to 160 pounds, as opposed to Belle's much taller, much sturdier frame, it was unlikely, then it meant that a serial killer was on the loose. At trial, Lamphere was actually acquitted of murder, but found guilty of arson and sentenced to 20 years in the state prison. A year later, he died, aged 39, of tuberculosis. However, after his death, the Reverend E.A. Shell produced a deathbed confession that Ray had made. And he said that he had never murdered anyone, but that he had helped Belle bury many of her victims. He explained that when a victim arrived at the farm, Belle made him feel comfortable, cooked him a substantial meal. She then drugged his coffee, often with strychnine, and while the man was incapacitated, she split his head open with a meat chopper or an axe, would then carry the body to the basement and dissect it before burying it in the hog pens. Ray also stated that the headless female corpse discovered in the house fire was more than likely a woman Belle had lured from Chicago and engaged as a housekeeper only days before. After murdering the woman and removing her head, which he said she weighted down and threw into a nearby swamp, she dressed the body in her clothes, removed her own false teeth and placed them beside the body, hoping that this would convince people of her identity. In the days before she disappeared, she had withdrawn almost all her savings. The fact that many said emphasized her decision to fake her death and run. For better or for worse, what happened to Belle will probably always remain one of the 20th century's greatest mysteries. If you enjoyed hearing about this case, do me a favour and leave a like or a comment. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.